The worst thing Tuan ever said to me, he said in front of everyone. It was the anniversary of my husband's death. The whole family had gathered in my house. The house Hung and I built together over 30 years. The house where our son Dung took his first steps across the tile floor. The house where I had cooked and cleaned and filed papers at the commune office and come home every evening to the same man sitting in the same chair reading the same newspaper. The incense was burning on the altar. 3 red sticks, thin smoke rising straight in the still air. Hung's photograph watched us all from behind the offerings, a bowl of rice, a tangerine, a small cup of tea I had brewed that morning while it was still dark outside. Tuan stood near the doorway. He always positioned himself near exits. I had noticed that about him for years. He wore his checked shirt, blue and white, the one he thought made him look like a businessman. His hair was combed too carefully. He was smiling before he even opened his mouth, which was how I knew the words would be bad. "Sister," he said, using the word the way people use tools they don't actually need. "You're getting older now. Your memory, your hands." He paused, letting the room absorb it. "You sign papers and don't even know what you signed anymore. Let us handle things. That's all we're asking." He said it gently. That was the part no one else seemed to notice. The gentleness was the cruelty. A slap is a slap, and everyone knows what it is. But a voice like warm water, words arranged just so, a tone that sounds like concern that is a different kind of damage entirely. Dung nodded. My own son, standing 3 feet from me, nodded. I looked at the incense. One thin thread of smoke curled upward and disappeared. I smiled. Not the smile people expect from an old woman being told she is too feeble to manage her own affairs. Not the embarrassed smile or the confused smile or the grateful smile. Just a small, quiet curve of the mouth that meant nothing to anyone in that room except me. No one asked why I was smiling. No one thought to. That moment lives in the front of my memory now, sharp and clear as a freshly cut document edge. But to understand what Tuan said, and why my smile meant what it meant, I have to go further back. Back past the anniversary. Back past the 3 years that preceded it. Back to the beginning of the arrangement, to the evening Tuan sat at this same table and told me he wanted to help. I was 65 then. Newly retired from the commune office after 27 years as a clerk, the last 11 as senior secretary, to 3 different committee chairmen. My hands knew the weight of official stamps. My eyes knew the difference between a document filed correctly and one filed to be found later, or not found at all. When you spend 3 decades recording what people agree to, you develop a particular sensitivity to the gap between what is spoken and what is written down. My husband had been gone 2 years. The apartment building we owned 4 floors, 8 units, on a narrow street near the market had been his project from the beginning. He had borrowed, saved, borrowed again, built it unit by unit through the 90s when everything was uncertain and the air smelled like possibility and fresh concrete. I had kept the books, every rent payment, every repair cost, every utility bill in my own handwriting in a green ledger I stored in the drawer beneath the altar. When Hung died, the building kept standing. Buildings do not grieve. They collect water in the drains and require the pipes checked every season and expect the rent to arrive on the 1st of the month regardless of who is crying inside the house. Tuan came to me with his checked shirt and his easy manner and his suggestion. "Sister, you shouldn't have to worry about all this. Managing tenants, collecting payments, dealing with repairs. You have enough to think about. Let me help. I know a man, very reliable. He can handle the day-to-day. You just receive your money each month. Rest. You deserve to rest." The man he knew was Hung, not my husband, a different Hung, younger, thicker around the middle, with a way of standing that took up more room than necessary. He had worked security at a building across the district. Tuan vouched for him completely. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 1 week. I watched Tuan during that week. The way he looked at the apartment building when he thought no one was watching. Not the way a person looks at something they want to protect, the way a person looks at something they are calculating. But Dung was working in the south. The tenants had started calling with small complaints, a leaking faucet, a broken lock, and I had no patience left for pretending these things did not exhaust me. I agreed. The first month, I received 6 million dong. Tuan delivered it himself, in an envelope, very correct, with a small handwritten note that said Rent Collection, Month 1. I put it in the drawer and recorded it in my green ledger. Date. Amount. Received from whom? 27 years of habit. The second month, 6 million. The third, the fourth. Each time the envelope arrived, Tuan brought it personally, always with some small conversation, always asking about my health, always glancing around the house with the eyes of a man who is measuring things. I received 6 million dong every month for 3 years. What I did not know then, what I was only beginning to suspect by the time of that anniversary, standing in front of my husband's incense with Tuan calling me forgetful in front of my own son, was that the tenants in my building were paying 12. The smoke rose from the incense in a straight, unbroken line. Old houses settle at night. This house had been settling for decades, and I knew every sound it made, the small tick from the third stair, the way the window in the back room sighed when the wind shifted. I had learned to sleep through all of it. But that night, after the family left, after Dung hugged me goodbye with the slightly too firm embrace of a man who has convinced himself he is being reasonable, after Tuan's car disappeared around the corner that night, I could not sleep. I sat at the altar for a long time. The incense had burned down to ash. Hung looked at me from his photograph, the one taken at Dung's university graduation, when he was still young enough to stand straight and proud without his back complaining. I thought about still water. There is a thing my grandmother used to say, a thing that women in our family pass down like a recipe or a scar. Still water runs deepest. The pond that makes no noise is the one that goes down and down and down until it touches something no one else can reach. It is not the rushing river that holds the cold, it is the surface that shows you nothing. I had spent 27 years being still water in a room full of officials who thought they were the river. I knew how to wait. I knew how to watch. I knew how to record exactly what I saw without letting my face reveal what I understood. Tuan had called me forgetful. He had said it softly, with concern, in front of witnesses. He had made my own son nod. What Tuan did not know, what he had no reason to suspect, because men like him never expect resistance from women who smile quietly and accept envelopes, was that I had kept my ledger for 3 years. Every entry, every date, every single 6 million dong. And the next morning, I was going to make a phone call to the woman in Unit 3, who had lived in my building since the beginning, who had always paid her rent in cash, and who I had a feeling, the particular feeling that comes from 30 years of reading documents, had a copy of her lease agreement somewhere in her apartment. Still water, it does not announce itself. It simply goes deep and deeper, and waits for the right moment to show exactly how far down it goes. My husband had terrible handwriting. This was the thing I thought about most, in the weeks after he died. Not his face, not his voice, not the particular way he cleared his throat before saying something he considered important. Those things came later, in waves, at unexpected moments, the smell of his soap when I opened the cabinet, the indentation in his chair that kept his shape for months before it finally softened back to flat. But the first thing, the thing that ambushed me in the commune office 3 days after the funeral, when I sat down to file a routine land transfer and picked up my pen, was his handwriting. Hung wrote like a man who had learned the alphabet in a hurry and never saw reason to slow down. Letters leaning forward, numbers cramped together, the character for agreement always slightly wrong in a way that was entirely his own. I had spent 27 years reading official documents, clean and precise, every stroke deliberate. And then I would come home and find his notes on the kitchen table, reminders to himself, calculations for the building, grocery lists that made no visual sense, and something in my chest would loosen. No one else could read his handwriting, only me. That felt, in the weeks after he died, like the cruelest small thing, all that meaning, encoded in those illegible loops, and I was the only one left who could decode it. We had not planned to own a building. In the early years we planned only to survive. Hung worked for the district transport office. I filed papers at the commune, first as a junior clerk, then slowly, carefully, as the years passed and chairmen came and went, as a woman who knew where everything was kept. We lived in 2 rented rooms on the 3rd floor of someone else's house. Dung slept in a corner we partitioned with a curtain. The curtain was blue, cotton, printed with small white clouds. We were not unhappy. That is the thing people misunderstand about modest lives. They assume the smallness is a wound. But there is a kind of wholeness in knowing exactly what you have, in counting it correctly, in understanding that the blue curtain and the three of you behind it and the bowl of soup on the table constitute, in fact, a sufficient world. The building came from Hung's refusal to stop looking forward. He had seen a plot of land, a narrow lot behind the market, in 1993. He talked about it for 2 years before he did anything. Every evening he would return from work and describe what he was imagining: 4 floors, 8 units, modest but solid, built to last. I listened. I had learned early in our marriage that Hung's dreaming was not separate from his doing. When he talked long enough about something, he was really drawing the blueprints. We borrowed from his older brother first, then from my mother. Then from a credit cooperative that charged interest. I recorded carefully in the margin of a green ledger I bought specifically for the project. The construction took 14 months. Hung supervised every step himself, arriving at the site on his bicycle before dawn, coming home with concrete dust on his clothes and satisfaction on his face. The first tenant moved in on a Thursday in March. I remember because I had taken the day off from the commune office to hand over the key, and it had rained, and the tenant, Mrs. Unga, Unit 3, a seamstress with 2 children and an umbrella that kept turning inside out in the wind, had laughed when she saw the state of the entrance, half-finished tiles and bare concrete, and said, "It's perfect. I always wanted to be somewhere from the beginning." She was still there 30 years later. Unit 3. First of the month. Always. Hung managed the building the way he managed everything, with a combination of stubbornness and warmth that made people feel they owed him something without ever feeling taken advantage of. He knew all the tenants' names, their children's names, the particular squeak of each unit's door. When a pipe burst on the 2nd floor in 2005, he was there at midnight with a wrench and rubber sandals and an apology for the inconvenience. I kept the books. That was our arrangement, unstated but absolute. He built things, fixed things, talked to people. I recorded what happened. Every payment, every expense, every repair. The green ledger filled, and I started a second, then a third. I dated every entry in the corner. I kept receipts folded inside the back cover. My mother used to say that a woman who controls the ledger controls the house. She meant it practically, not philosophically. She meant, know where the money goes, know what was promised and to whom. A signature on paper outlasts the memory of the person who made it. 27 years in a commune office taught me the same lesson in a larger room. Dung grew up understanding that his parents worked. He did not grow up understanding what we were building. Children rarely do. They see the present tense, the dinner table, the school fees, the occasional treat, and do not think to look at the ledger underneath. By the time he was old enough to understand the building represented something significant, he was already in the South, already building his own present tense, already accumulating his own things to not look at carefully enough. He called on Sundays. He was a good son in the way that good sons who live far away are good sons. Consistent, affectionate, not particularly attentive. He trusted that things were fine because I told him they were fine. And I told him they were fine because they were. And because the alternative explaining the full weight of managing 8 tenants and an aging building and a ledger that required someone who understood what they were reading felt like more trouble than the honesty was worth. After Hung died, I sat with the ledger for a full evening before I did anything else. Not grieving, not yet, just reading. Going back through the entries in his handwriting, the early years when he had kept the records himself before I took over, those cramped illegible numbers, the character for agreement always slightly wrong, and then my own handwriting taking over, precise and vertical, entry after entry after entry. The building had been good to us. Steady income, modest but reliable. 8 units, full occupancy most years. The occasional month when a unit sat empty between tenants and I marked it in red. The building had paid for Dung's university. It had paid for 2 surgeries Hung needed in his last years. It had sat there on that narrow street behind the market, solid and plain, doing what he had always imagined it would do. I closed the ledger and put it in the drawer beneath the altar. I thought, I will figure out what comes next. What came next, 2 months later, was Tuan sitting at my kitchen table with his checked shirt and his easy manner, telling me about a reliable man he knew who could handle the day-to-day. I thought about it for 1 week, the way I said. I watched Tuan during that week. What I did not do, and what I have thought about often since, was open the drawer and put the ledger on the table between us. I did not say, "Let me show you what this building has cost and what it has returned, number by number, year by year, so we both understand exactly what we are discussing before any agreement is made." I did not do that. Not because I was forgetful. Not because I was too old or too tired or too confused to understand what I was signing. I did not do it because I was trying to be the kind of widow who did not make things difficult. That was my mistake. Not the only one, and not the last. But the first, and the one I returned to most often in the long evenings that followed, when I sat at the altar and thought about what my mother had told me, and what the commune office had taught me, and what Hung's terrible handwriting in a green ledger had meant. You cannot be still water and accommodating water at the same time. And I had spent 2 years after his death trying to be both, which is how I had handed Tuan exactly the opening he needed. Outside, a motorbike passed on the street below, then another, then silence. The kind of silence that sits in old houses, the way furniture sits present, familiar, and impossible to move without revealing what has been accumulating in the dust beneath it all along. The man Tuan brought me was punctual. I will give him that. Hung, the building manager, the other Hung, the one with the way of standing that took up more room than he had earned, arrived every first of the month without fail, sometimes the 31st, if the first fell on a holiday. He wore the same style of clothing each time. Dark trousers, a collared shirt in a muted color, shoes that were clean but not new. He carried the rent envelope in his shirt pocket, not his bag, which I noticed because it meant he had already separated it from whatever else he was carrying. A small thing. The kind of small thing you file away without knowing why. The first month I accepted the envelope without opening it in front of him. Old courtesy. You do not count money in front of the person who brought it. Later, alone at the kitchen table, I counted it. 6 million dong. Correct, I thought. 8 units, some paying less than others according to the arrangement Hung had made when he was alive, the older tenants given lower rates out of loyalty and something close to affection. I had not reviewed the individual lease amounts in some time. My husband had managed those negotiations himself in the final years, when my hours at the commune office had lengthened and the chairman had become more demanding. I trusted his judgment. I had always trusted his judgment. I recorded the amount in the green ledger. Date. Amount. Manager's name. I used the abbreviation I had invented for him. H2. Not unkind, just precise. There was only one Hung who mattered in that ledger, and he was already gone. The second month passed the same way, the third. By the fourth month I had stopped thinking about the envelope's contents before it arrived. 6 million dong, first of the month, H2 in dark trousers with clean shoes. It had become a rhythm, and rhythms are dangerous because they train you to stop listening. The first discrepancy was not the money, it was a receipt. 8 months into the arrangement, H2 came to me with a request. The second-floor unit needed a new water heater. The old one had corroded, a slow leak developing into a faster one, and the tenant, a young couple, renters for only a year, had been patient but was running out of patience. H2 had found a supplier. The cost would be 2,800,000 dong. Did I want to approve the expense? I said yes. I asked for the receipt afterward so I could record it. He brought it the following week. A printed slip from a supply shop in the district, the name of the shop, the item, the price, H2's signature, at the bottom where it said, "Received by." I put it in the drawer with the ledger, filed it in the envelope I kept for repair expenses, dated in my handwriting in the upper right corner. What I noticed, and set aside, and returned to 3 days later when I could not explain why it bothered me, was the date on the receipt. The water heater had been installed, according to H2, in the 3rd week of the month. The receipt was dated the 2nd week. A supplier prints the receipt when the item is sold, not when it is installed. I understood that. The gap made sense. I was not suspicious of the gap. What I was suspicious of was the price. 2,800,000 dong for a mid-range water heater. I had not bought a water heater in many years, but I had filed the paperwork for the commune office's facility repairs long enough to carry rough numbers in my head. The price felt high. Not wildly high. Just slightly, carefully high. The way a number looks when someone has added a margin, and relied on the other person not checking. I did not say anything. I was new to this arrangement. H2 was Tuan's recommendation, and Tuan was my husband's brother, and I was a widow 8 months into managing alone, and I did not want to be the kind of woman who made accusations from an instinct about a water heater receipt. But I wrote the price in the margin of the ledger. And I wrote beside it, in smaller characters, check market rate. I did not check immediately. I told myself I would get to it. The thing about small corruptions is that they are designed to feel like misunderstandings. H2 was always polite. He answered my questions directly, or appeared to. When the plumbing on the 4th floor needed attention 6 months later, he came to me in advance this time, before the work was done, with a written estimate on a piece of paper torn from a notebook informal, handwritten, but present, an improvement, or what looked like an improvement. The estimate said 1,500,000 dong. The receipt he brought afterwards said 1,900,000. I recorded both figures in the ledger. I wrote the difference in the margin, 400,000. And below that, in the small characters I had started using for notes I did not want to explain. Second variation. By this point I had begun to understand that I was keeping 2 ledgers in my head simultaneously. The official one, the entries in green, the dates and amounts that corresponded to what I was told. And the other one, the marginalia, the small questions I wrote in handwriting even smaller than my usual precision, the numbers that did not quite align, the receipts with dates that preceded work, the estimates that did not match invoices. 27 years in a commune office will give you this particular skill, whether you want it or not. You learn to see the document and the shadow of the document at the same time. You learn that official papers often tell you less about what happened than about what someone wanted recorded. The real story lives in the gap between the filed version and the version that was actually lived. I had spent my career reading that gap for other people's transactions. I was beginning to suspect I had been too slow to read it for my own. Tuan visited more frequently now. This should have been a comfort attentive family. Checking in, but comfort was not what I felt when I heard his car on the street below. He always arrived with a reason. A small gift. A question about my health. Once a bag of fruit from a market he had passed on the way. He sat at the kitchen table and drank tea and asked about dung, about the neighbors, about whether I needed anything. He never asked about the building directly. That was what I noticed. He asked around it. Questions that circled the subject without landing. How are the tenants treating you? Any problems with the management? You must be relieved not to have to deal with the day-to-day. I answered the way I had learned to answer questions from officials who were building a case, directly, briefly, without volunteering. Everything is fine. H2 handles it. I receive the rent. Yes, it is a relief. Tuan would nod and smile, and refill his own teacup, and eventually leave, and I would sit for a moment afterward in the particular stillness that follows a conversation that was entirely about nothing, while appearing to be about something. The last time he visited before the anniversary, the visit I thought about later as the visit when I became certain, not just suspicious, he paused at the door on his way out, and turned back with an expression I recognized from the commune office. The expression of a man who has decided to say the thing he came to say. Sister, he said, the building's lease agreements are getting old. Some of them Anhung drafted himself, years ago. They might need updating. If you ever want me to have someone look them over, I know people. Lawyers who specialize in rental properties. It would be very straightforward. I looked at him. I still have all the original documents, I said. Everything is filed correctly. He smiled. Of course. I just meant if you ever need help. You shouldn't have to manage all that paper alone. He left. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the altar at the far end of the room, at Hung's photograph, at the cold ash in the incense holder. Lease agreements. He had mentioned lease agreements. I went to the drawer beneath the altar and opened it. The green ledger was there, exactly where I had placed it. Behind it, the envelopes of receipts, the repair records, the original documents from the building's first year. I pulled out the folder where I kept the tenant agreements. 8 leases, 1 per unit, all drafted in the mid-90s when the building was new. My husband's handwriting on the original drafts. My own corrections in the margins. Official stamps from the commune office. My own stamp from the years when I had been authorized to certify residential rental agreements. I counted them. 7. I counted again. 7 leases, 8 units, 1 missing. I sat on the floor in front of the open drawer and thought about which unit was unaccounted for, and what a man who wanted to update lease agreements might do with an original document that no longer existed in the owner's possession, and whether the tenant in that unit still had her copy. Mrs. Na, Unit 3, the seamstress with the umbrella that kept turning inside out. She had been there from the beginning. She had laughed on a rainy Thursday in March and said she always wanted to be somewhere from the beginning. I needed to know if she was still keeping her paperwork as carefully as I had kept mine. I did not go to Mrs. Na immediately. This is the part I am least proud of, looking back. I sat on the floor in front of the open drawer for perhaps 10 minutes, the folder of 7 leases in my lap, the empty space where the 8th should have been as loud as a missing tooth and a familiar smile. Then I stood up, replaced the folder, closed the drawer, and went to make dinner. Rice. Vegetables, the same meal I made on most evenings. The sound of the water coming to a boil, the smell of garlic and hot oil. The ordinary machinery of an ordinary evening, which I needed very badly in that moment. I told myself I would think about the missing lease tomorrow. Tomorrow became 3 days. Not avoidance, exactly. Or not only avoidance, partly it was calculation. I had spent 27 years in a room where information was power and the release of information was strategy. You do not act on the first number you find. You verify. You cross-reference. You make sure that what you think you are reading is what the document actually says before you carry that reading into a room where someone might challenge it. I needed to be certain which lease was missing before I spoke to anyone about any of it. On the 4th morning I made a list. I wrote out all 8 units from memory, the floor, the unit number, the tenant name as I recalled it, the original monthly rent from the agreements my husband had drafted. Then I opened the folder again and matched what I had written against what was there. Unit 3, Mrs. Na. Lease missing. Only hers. I sat with that for a moment. Of all the leases to disappear, the one belonging to the tenant who had been there longest, the one who had moved in on the first day, in the rain, with the inside-out umbrella, the one who would have watched the building change over 30 years, who would know better than anyone what the original arrangements had been, what had been promised, what had been honored, the one whose memory would be most valuable to someone trying to rewrite history, and the one whose copy, if she still had it, would be most dangerous to someone who had already taken mine. Mrs. Na opened her door before I had finished knocking. She was a small woman, smaller than I remembered from our last real conversation, which had been perhaps a year before at Tet, when I had brought oranges to each unit the way my husband always had. Her hair was white now, cut short in a practical way. She wore the kind of housecoat that women our age wear when they are not expecting visitors, faded blue with small buttons at the collar. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of a person recalibrating. "Mrs. Chow," she said, "come in. I'll make tea." Her unit was neat in the way that small spaces become neat when someone has lived in them long enough to reach an understanding with every object. A sewing machine near the window with good light. Fabric folded on a shelf. Photographs on the wall, children and grandchildren in the slightly formal poses of pictures taken on important occasions. We sat at her small table and I waited while she made tea, the way you wait when you have something difficult to ask and want to arrive at it correctly. "How is the building treating you?" I asked first. Small question, safe ground. She set down the cups and looked at me with the directness of a woman who has lived in someone else's building for 30 years and has earned the right to speak plainly. "The building is fine," she said. "The manager is another matter." I kept my hands still around my cup. "What do you mean?" She was quiet for a moment, not reluctant. I thought more like a person choosing where to begin a story she has been waiting to tell. 3 months ago," she said, "the manager came to me with a new lease." I set my cup down. Slowly. A new lease. He said the old agreements needed updating, that the owner had authorized new standard contracts for all units. He had a document. She paused. I did not sign it. "Why not?" She looked at me steadily. "Because I still have my original lease. The one your husband gave me when I moved in, and the new document had a different rental amount. Higher. and some terms I did not recognize. She folded her hands on the table, and because I have lived here 30 years, Mrs. Chow, and no one told me directly. He just appeared at my door with papers and a pen. The tea was cooling between my hands. I could hear the sewing machine's silence, the absent sound of work paused. Did he say anything when you refused? He said it was routine. He said all the other tenants had already signed. He smiled the whole time. She said it the way you describe weather that has already passed observationally, without drama. He came back once more, 2 weeks later. I told him again. He stopped coming after that. Do you still have the document he brought? She rose without answering, and went to the shelf beside the sewing machine. From behind a folded length of fabric she withdrew a manila envelope, the kind used for official correspondence, and placed it on the table in front of me. I opened it. Inside was a 2-page lease agreement, printed on paper that looked official without being official, the font, the layout, the arrangement of clauses all resembling the genuine article closely enough to pass a quick reading. At the top, where the owner's name should have appeared, it said, Nguyen Thanh Tuan, representative of the property. Not my name, Tuan's. I read it again and again. Representative of the property. Not manager, not agent. Representative, which is a word that in rental documents carries a specific legal weight, the weight of someone acting on behalf of an owner who has granted them authority, or of someone claiming an authority that has not been granted but has not yet been challenged. My hands were steady. I am noting this not for pride but for accuracy. My hands were steady, and my breathing was even, and the only indication that something significant was happening inside my chest was the fact that I had to consciously remind myself to put the document down instead of gripping it tighter. May I keep this? I asked. I made a copy, Mrs. Na said. The original is yours. I looked at her. There was something in her expression that I recognized the look of a person who has been waiting for the right person to arrive and is relieved that they finally have. Your original lease, I said. The one my husband gave you. She went back to the shelf. From a different spot, lower down, behind something else I could not see, she produced a second envelope, older, the paper softened with age, the edges worn at the corners from being handled and replaced over many years. She set it in front of me without opening it. I did not open it either, not yet. I looked at the outside, my husband's handwriting on the front, the unit number, the tenant name, the date March, 30 years ago, the rainy Thursday when a woman with an inside-out umbrella moved into an unfinished building and said she had always wanted to be somewhere from the beginning. His handwriting. The character for agreement, slightly wrong in a way that was entirely his own. The rent on that lease, I said carefully, not looking up. What does it say? The current amount, after the last adjustment my husband made before he died. Mrs. Nya answered without hesitation. The way people answer questions they have known the answer to for a long time. The number she said was not 6 million. It was not close to 6 million. I looked up from the envelope in my hands, and outside the window the afternoon light was doing something ordinary and indifferent to the narrow street below, and somewhere in the building above us a door opened and closed, and I sat very still and understood that the gap between the number Mrs. Nja had just spoken and the number I had been recording in my ledger for 3 years was not an accounting error, not a misunderstanding, not a rounding difference that could be explained away by anything except the deliberate and sustained theft of money from a woman they had decided was too old and too tired and too grateful to count. But what I had not yet understood, what I would not understand until I had gone back to my drawer and opened the green ledger and cross-referenced every entry against the original lease amounts for all 8 units was that Mrs. Na's rent was not the only number that had been wrong. It was just the first one she had told me. I went home and I opened all 7 leases. Not just Mrs. Na's, all 7 that remained in my folder, the ones that had not disappeared, the ones I had assumed were intact because they were present. I laid them across the kitchen table in order of floor and unit number, smoothing each page flat with the edge of my hand the way I used to smooth official documents before stamping them, a habit so old it had stopped being deliberate. Then I opened the green ledger to the first month of H2's arrangement and I began to read. It took 2 hours. I am a methodical person. I do not rush a comparison when accuracy matters, and accuracy mattered now more than it had ever mattered in 27 years of commune paperwork. I worked unit by unit, lease by lease, cross-referencing the original rental amounts my husband had negotiated against the single monthly sum I had been recording for 3 years, 6 million dong, first of the month, delivered in an envelope by a man in dark trousers with clean shoes. By the time I reached the last page, the kitchen had grown dark around me, and I had not noticed. I sat in the dark for a moment before reaching up to turn on the light. The total monthly rent across all 8 units, calculated from the original lease amounts, adjusted for the 2 increases my husband had made in his last years, which were recorded in his own handwriting in the margins of the relevant agreements, the total was 11,400,000 dong, not 6 million. 11,400,000. For 36 months. I did the subtraction the way I had been trained to do subtraction. Carefully, twice, and then a third time to confirm. The difference between what I had been receiving and what I should have been receiving, compounded across 3 years, was approximately 197 million dong, nearly 200 million dong, taken from me. In increments small enough to feel like rounding errors if you were not paying attention. 6 million was a plausible number for a building of this size, for someone who had not reviewed the original leases recently, for a widow who was grateful to have the burden lifted, who was trying not to make things difficult. They had known exactly how plausible it would sound. I sat at my kitchen table with the leases spread before me, and the ledger open, and the light casting everything in the flat yellow of an ordinary evening, and I thought about the word patient, how it can mean 2 completely different things depending on who is being patient and why. The patience of someone tending something slowly toward health, and the patience of someone waiting for the right moment to take what they have already decided belongs to them. The next morning I went back to Mrs. Nga. I had one more question. I had not asked it the day before, because I had not yet known to ask it. Now I knew. She opened the door in the same housecoat, which made me think she had not been sleeping well either, or that she spent her mornings close to the door in case someone came back. I sat down at her small table without waiting to be invited. She sat across from me and folded her hands and waited. The manager, I said, H2, when he comes to collect rent each month, how does he collect it? Cash? Transfer? Cash, she said. Always cash. He brings a receipt. What does the receipt look like? She went to the shelf again. She was a woman who kept everything, which is a quality I had always respected, and respected more now than ever. She returned with a small stack of paper slips held together with a rubber band and placed them on the table. I picked up the top slip. It was a printed receipt, the kind generated by a simple accounting program, the sort of document that looks official at a glance without being issued by any authority. At the top, Property Management Services rental receipt. Below that, the unit number, the date, the amount paid, a signature line where H2 had signed in a loose, fast hand. The amount on the top receipt was 6,500,000 dong. I set it down. Picked up the next one. 6,200,000. The next. 6,800,000. Not a fixed amount. Variable, month to month, reflecting actual lease rates. Individual per unit agreements. The real numbers, the numbers I had never seen because I had been receiving a single consolidated envelope that bore no relationship to the actual transactions taking place in my building every month. H2 was collecting the real rent from each tenant individually, issuing each tenant a real receipt for the real amount, and then delivering to me a single envelope containing less than half of what he had collected, with no accounting, no breakdown, no documentation of any kind. And the receipts, the actual evidence of every transaction, the paper trail that would show exactly what had been paid and when and by whom, were sitting in a stack on Mrs. Nga's shelf with a rubber band around them, because she was the kind of woman who kept everything. I looked up at her. Did the other tenants keep their receipts? I asked. She considered this. Mrs. Fuang in Unit 5? Certainly. She keeps everything, even grocery receipts. Mr. and Mrs. Lam on the 4th floor, probably. The young couple in Unit 2. I don't know. They moved in only 8 months ago. I thought about that. 8 months ago, shortly after Tuan had mentioned lease agreements at my door, and I had told him I still had all the original documents, shortly after the missing lease would have been noticed, if anyone had been checking. Mrs. Na, I said, the new tenant in Unit 2. Do you know their name? She told me. I did not recognize it. And before them? Who lived in Unit 2 before them? She looked at me with the careful expression of a woman who has been holding a piece of information and waiting to understand whether it was important. No one, she said. It has been occupied continuously. The same tenant for 4 years. A school teacher. She moved out very suddenly, in the spring. She told me there had been some confusion about the lease, that the terms had changed and she couldn't afford the new rate. What new rate? She didn't say exactly. She seemed embarrassed. Upset. Mrs. Nga paused. She said the owner had decided to restructure the rental agreements, that the building was under new management terms. The school teacher had been told the owner had decided to restructure, not the representative of the property, the owner. I placed my hands flat on the table. Mrs. Nga, the document H2 brought you, the one you refused to sign, the one that named Tuan as representative of the property. Yes, he brought that to you 8 months ago. Around the same time the school teacher in Unit 2 was being told the owner was restructuring. She looked at me steadily and said nothing, which was its own answer. I picked up the stack of receipts and asked if I could borrow them. She said she had copies. Of course she had copies. She was that kind of woman. I walked home slowly, the receipts in my bag, my mind moving faster than my feet. The thefts were one thing. Nearly 200 million dong taken across 3 years. That was serious, that was documented, that was a matter I could bring to the right people with the right evidence and expect a real outcome. Painful, yes. A violation, yes. But recoverable. What was sitting in my mind now, heavier and colder, was the school teacher. A tenant told the owner had restructured things, moved out confused and embarrassed, replaced within weeks by a new tenant whose lease I had never seen, whose agreement with my building had been negotiated entirely without my knowledge, who was paying rent to H2 every month under terms I could not verify because the document did not exist in my folder. The question was not whether Tuan had been stealing rent from me for 3 years. I knew that now with the certainty of 200 million dong, spread across 36 months of careful entries in a green ledger. The question was, what a man who had already done that would do next. A man who was rewriting leases and replacing tenants, and positioning himself in documents as the representative of a property that was not his. A man who had, very quietly and over a very long time, been constructing a paper version of my building in which he was the one who mattered, and I was simply the old woman upstairs who didn't understand what she had signed. I put my key in the lock and opened the door and stood in the hallway looking at the altar, at Hung's photograph, at the cold ash I had not yet replaced. Then I went to the drawer and looked again at the folder. And this time I looked not at what was missing but at what was there, and I read the name on the first page of the first lease I picked up, and I understood that I had been wrong about something. The missing lease was not Unit 3. It was not the only one missing. There were 3. And the 3 units without leases in my folder were not random. They were the ground floor units, the ones with street-facing doors, the ones that in any conversion from residential rental to commercial property would be the most valuable, the first to be renegotiated, the foundation on which everything above them rested. Someone had not just been stealing my rent. Someone had been quietly, methodically, dismantling the legal ground beneath my feet, and they had been doing it one document at a time, in the dark, while I made dinner and trusted the rhythm of an envelope on the first of the month. And the person who had access to my house, my drawer, my documents, every time he came to sit at my kitchen table and drink tea and ask about my health, had a key. I looked at the lock on my front door and thought about how long it had been since I had changed it, and who besides Dung had a copy, and when exactly Tuan had offered to help me with the building, and whether, in that early confusing month of arrangements and adjustments, I had handed him the means to let himself in whenever I was not there. I could not remember. That was the thing I could not remember. And for the first time since this had begun, I felt something that was not calculation or patience or the steady methodical turning of a problem toward the light. I felt afraid. Fear is useful if you do not let it speak first. I had learned this in the commune office, in the early years when I was young enough to be intimidated by men with titles and loud voices who expected deference from a woman behind a desk. The fear was always there, the tight feeling in the chest, the awareness of how easily things could go wrong if the wrong person decided to make them go wrong. But I had learned to let that feeling settle before I acted on it, to sit with it until it became information rather than reaction. I was afraid that Tuan had a key to my house. I sat with that fear until it told me what to do. The next morning, before anything else, I called a locksmith. I told him the lock was stiff and I was having trouble with it in the evenings. This was not entirely untrue. The lock had always been slightly resistant in damp weather. He came within the hour. A young man who replaced the cylinder efficiently and handed me 3 new keys without asking questions. I gave him a tip larger than the job warranted. He left. I stood in the hallway with 3 clean keys in my hand and felt the fear settle into something more manageable. First thing, then I made a list. Not in the green ledger that was a record of what had happened, and I did not want to contaminate it with the investigation I was about to conduct. I took a fresh notebook from the shelf. One I had bought the previous year for a purpose I had since forgotten, its pages still unmarked. Small, cloth-covered, navy blue, the kind of notebook that does not look important. I wrote the date at the top of the first page. Below it, I wrote 3 unit numbers, the ground floor units, the ones missing from my folder. Below that, 3 columns, tenant name, current rent paid, lease status. I knew one of those tenant names already. The others I would have to learn. I did not go to them directly. Not yet. A woman who appears at her tenant's doors asking questions about leases and payment amounts is a woman who has revealed her hand before she knows what cards are being held against her. I had spent too many years watching officials overplay their information to make that mistake now. Instead, I started with what I already had. I went back to the green ledger and I did what I should have done 3 years ago, which was read it not as a record of income but as a document of absence. Every entry was there. Every 6 million, first of the month, 3 years of envelopes. But between those entries were the repair costs, the water heater, the plumbing, the 2 occasions when H2 had come with receipts for work I had not seen performed, for amounts that had not matched the follow-up receipts. For services rendered to units I now needed to cross-reference against what the tenants themselves might remember. I made a separate column in the Navy notebook. Repairs claimed. Amounts paid. Units affected. Then I called Mrs. Fuang in Unit 5. I did not ask about rent or leases. I asked about the bathroom tiles. I said I was reviewing some old maintenance records and wanted to confirm that the work from 2 years ago had been satisfactory. She said what bathroom tiles no one had touched her bathroom in 4 years, and she had reported the cracked grout twice to H2 without any response. I thanked her and said I would follow up. Repair claimed. Amount, 800,000 dong. Work, never performed. I wrote it down. I called Mr. Lam on the 4th floor. Same approach. The electrical work from 18 months ago, had it resolved the flickering in the hallway light? He was silent for a moment. He said the hallway light had been flickering since before the Lunar New Year of last year, and he had brought it up with H2 3 times, and H2 had said he would send someone, and no one had come. Repair claimed. Amount, 1,200,000 dong. Work, never performed. I wrote it down. By the afternoon I had called 4 tenants about 4 separate repairs. Of the 4, 2 had never received any maintenance work at all. 1 had received work, but later than the receipt date and performed by someone who had not identified himself as working on behalf of the building owner. The 4th could not remember clearly, and I did not press. 2 confirmed phantom repairs. A total of 2 million dong claimed and pocketed. Small amounts compared to the rent discrepancy. But each one was its own proof of intent. You do not accidentally invent a repair receipt. You do not accidentally record money spent on work you did not do. These were not errors. They were a system. Small enough individually to dismiss as mistakes, consistent enough together to form a pattern that pointed in only one direction. I added the phantom repair total to the rent discrepancy in the corner of the Navy notebook and underlined the combined figure twice. On the 3rd day, I allowed myself to think about Tuan directly, not with anger. Anger was a temperature I could not afford. I thought about him the way I would have thought about a problematic document in the commune office as a problem with a structure, and therefore a problem with a solution, if you understood the structure clearly enough. Tuan was my husband's younger brother. He had always occupied the comfortable position of the charming relative present enough to be liked, absent enough to avoid responsibility. Hung had been fond of him in the resigned way of older siblings who have spent decades explaining the same lessons to someone who listens without learning. I had been polite. That was the extent of my feeling for him, polite. What he had done to me was not a crime of passion or resentment. It was a business decision. He had looked at my building and seen an asset, looked at me and seen an obstacle, and calculated that the obstacle was elderly and grieving and unlikely to count carefully. He had been almost right. That almost was my advantage. I thought about my grandmother's phrase, the one I had carried since childhood, the one that surfaced now with the specific weight of its full meaning. Still, water runs deepest. The bamboo bends in the storm, but the roots go down and down into the dark earth where no wind reaches. You cannot uproot what you cannot see. And what bends is not what breaks. I had been bending for 3 years without knowing it. Now I knew where my roots were. On the 4th day, I went to see a man named Mr. Hong. He was a retired notary who had worked in the district for 30 years before his eyesight declined and he stepped back from official practice. He lived 3 streets away. He had certified several of my husband's property documents in the early years of the building, and we had maintained the kind of cordial acquaintance that comes from occasional professional contact over a long period of time. I brought him bine, a small box, the kind you bring when you are visiting someone whose help you need and want to ask for correctly. We sat in his front room, which smelled of camphor and old paper. Which smelled, in other words, like a room where documents were taken seriously. I told him what I had found. Not everything. Not the fear about the key. Not the navy notebook with its growing columns. But enough. The missing leases. The name on the unauthorized document, Mrs. Na, had been asked to sign, the phrase representative of the property. He listened with the stillness of a man who has heard many documents described and knows which words carry weight. Representative of the property, he repeated. In a rental agreement? With his name, not mine. He was quiet for a moment. That phrase, used that way, without a formal power of attorney on file, it establishes nothing legally. But it creates an impression. Repeated across multiple documents, signed by multiple tenants, it begins to look like a record. Like an established relationship between that person and that property. A record that could be used. A record that could be argued from, he said carefully, in certain circumstances, by someone with a lawyer and enough patience. I thanked him for his time. I left the bon and stood up to go. At the door, he said, without me asking, if I were looking for evidence of unauthorized representation, I would want the original signed copies from any tenants who kept them, and I would want to know whether any of those documents had been filed anywhere officially. Land registry, tax office, anywhere that a paper might have been submitted without the actual owner's knowledge. I stopped. Can a document be submitted to the land registry? I said slowly, without the owner's signature? Not legally, he said, but documents have been submitted with signatures that were approximate. He said approximate the way a doctor says irregular. Carefully, and with full understanding of what the word implied. I walked home through the afternoon heat, with the sun pressing flat and white on the pavement, and the smell of exhaust and fried dough from the stalls at the corner. The ordinary sensory texture of an ordinary street, and I thought about the word approximate and what it meant in the context of a man who had been sitting at my kitchen table for 3 years, who had watched me sign routine documents, who had seen my handwriting on 100 receipts and ledger entries, who would know exactly what my signature looked like. At home I went directly to the drawer under the altar and removed every document I still had. Every lease, every receipt, every maintenance record, everything. I spread it all on the kitchen table, and I looked at it with the eyes of someone checking not for what was there but for what had been changed. The 3rd lease I examined stopped me. Unit 1, ground floor. The original document in my husband's handwriting, the slightly wrong character for agreement that only I would recognize, the tenant name and terms from 30 years ago. But at the bottom, in the margin beside the signature block, there was a notation I had not made. Small, neat, in an ink slightly darker than the rest of the page. Authorized for review and amendment, followed by a date 18 months ago. Followed by a signature. My signature. or something so close to my signature that I had to look at it 3 times before I could be certain I had never written it. I sat down at the table and placed my hand over the page and felt something cold move through me that was not fear this time but something with a sharper edge. Someone had been practicing, and they had gotten very good. They came on a Tuesday morning, which told me something. Tuesday is not a day when people visit socially. It has no particular significance, no proximity to weekends or holidays, no association with celebration or obligation. Tuesday is a day for transactions, for appointments made by people who have decided that a thing will happen and are arriving to make it happen, and who have chosen a day so unremarkable that the person receiving them will not have had time to prepare. I had been awake since 5, not because I suspected Tuesday specifically, because I had not slept well in 2 weeks, not since I had found the forged notation on the lease for Unit 1, and sleeping poorly had given me the gift of early mornings in which I sat at the kitchen table with the Navy notebook and thought very carefully about what I was building and what I still needed and how much time I might have before Tuan decided that patience had run its course. The answer, it turned out, was 2 weeks. At 9:15 I heard a car on the street below, then a second. I did not go to the window immediately. I went to the altar first, out of habit or something older than habit, and I looked at Hung's photograph for a moment, and then I went to the window. Tuan's car, and behind it, a silver sedan I did not recognize. 3 men getting out. Tuan in his checked shirt, H2 in dark trousers, and a third man in a gray suit carrying a leather briefcase, moving with the particular purposefulness of someone who is being paid by the hour and intends to finish quickly. I knew what a lawyer walking toward a door looked like. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on because if they were going to come into my house, I was going to be standing in my kitchen doing something ordinary when they arrived. I did not touch the Navy notebook. It was already in the drawer with the green ledger, beneath the folder of documents I had spent 2 weeks quietly reassembling. They knocked. I counted to 5 before answering. Tuan came in first, which was how it always was with him moving into spaces like he had already been invited. Like the invitation was a formality that his presence had already superseded. He smiled with his whole face, the way he smiled when he was most certain of something, and the certainty this morning was very visible. "Sister," he said, "we need to talk about the building. I've brought someone who can help make things clear." The lawyer's name was Mr. Fott. He introduced himself with a card that I accepted and placed on the kitchen table without reading. He had the manner of a man who had delivered unwelcome news enough times to have made it comfortable for himself, if not for the person receiving it. H2 stood near the door. He did not sit down when the others sat. He stood with the posture of a man who expected to be leaving soon and saw no point in getting comfortable. I poured tea for Tuan and Mr. Fott. I did not pour tea for H2. Tuan accepted his cup and looked around the room the way he had been looking around this room for 3 years, assessing, calculating, and I watched him do it with the particular attention of someone who has finally understood what the looking means. "Sister," he began again. He liked that word. He used it as a softener, a diminisher, a way of placing me in a role, the older woman, the relative, the person who should be grateful for the concern of the people around her. "I've been thinking about the building for a long time. About what happens to it, about what you can manage, and what has become too much." "The building is fine," I said. "Tea? Please listen." A slight edge now, beneath the warmth. "Mr. Fott has prepared some documents. Straightforward documents. A formal management agreement that puts the current arrangement on proper legal footing, and a limited power of attorney that would allow me to handle lease negotiations and maintenance contracts on your behalf, which is already what I'm doing informally." What he was already doing. Already doing. I looked at my teacup. Mr. Fott opened his briefcase and placed 2 documents on the table in front of me. Clean pages, professional formatting, the kind of official-looking paperwork that is designed to be signed rather than read. He uncapped a pen and set it beside them with a small, precise click. "These are standard instruments," he said. "The management agreement simply formalizes the existing relationship. The power of attorney is limited in scope. It pertains only to the property in question and only to routine management functions." Routine, there was that word again. The word people use when they want something to happen without discussion. I did not pick up the pen. I'd like to read them, I said. Of course. Mr. Fott sat back with the expression of a man who has said of course, while meaning take as long as you need because we are not leaving until this is done. I read slowly. I had always been a slow reader of documents, not because I could not read quickly, but because speed was how errors got buried, and I had spent too many years finding buried errors to give them the advantage of my haste. The management agreement was what Tuan had described, on the surface. But in the third clause, in language that sounded administrative, it established that the property manager, named as Nguyen Thanh Tuan, had authority to execute lease agreements on behalf of the owner for terms of up to 3 years, without requiring the owner's signature on individual contracts. Without requiring the owner's signature, the power of attorney was broader than Mr. Fat had indicated. It authorized Tuan to represent my interests before any government body, including the land registry, in matters pertaining to the property. It included a clause about dispute resolution that would have required any challenge to his authority to go through arbitration rather than the courts, with an arbitration body he had specified by name. I set the pages down. Sister. Tuan leaned forward, his voice dropping into the register of compassion. I know this feels like a lot, but you're not as young as you were. Managing a building is complicated. The regulations change, the tenant relationships are demanding, and you've been doing this alone since An Hung passed. We want to help. Dung wants this too, I spoke to him last week, and he agrees that having proper legal structures in place would give everyone peace of mind. Dung. He had spoken to Dung. I thought about my son, far away, busy, trusting because I had always told him things were fine, trusting because Tuan was charming and Tuan was family and Tuan had been calling him. I now understood, not to catch up, but to build consensus. To create the impression that the family had already agreed, that I was the last one to come around. Dung is in favor of this? I asked. He wants you to have support. Tuan smiled. He's relieved someone is taking an interest. You know how he worries. I looked at H2 near the door. He was looking at his phone. He was not concerned about the outcome of this conversation. Not because he was indifferent, but because he already knew how it ended. They had done this before, not to me, to someone else, somewhere else. This briefcase, these papers, this Tuesday morning approach, this invocation of family consensus, and the weight of concern from people who loved you, it was practiced. It was a procedure. Mr. Fott tapped the pen once against the table, a small sound, barely audible. Mrs. Chow. If you have questions about specific clauses, I'm happy to explain. The arbitration body in Clause 7, I said. I'm not familiar with them. They're very reputable. We've worked with them on several similar matters. He had said it without thinking, and then his expression adjusted slightly, and I filed the adjustment away. I'd like to have someone else review these before I sign, I said. A few days. The warmth in Tuan's face did not disappear exactly. It recalibrated, became something thinner, more deliberate. Sister, the current arrangement creates real legal ambiguity. For your protection, the sooner this is formalized. A few days, I said again. The 3 men exchanged a look. Not a dramatic look. A small, quick, professional exchange of information between people who had encountered this particular obstacle before and had a procedure for it. Tuan placed his hand over mine on the table. His hand was warm. Of course, he said. But I do want to mention some of the tenants have already signed updated agreements. The building is already operating under new terms in most units. Delaying formalization on your end creates a gap that could complicate things for you legally. He paused. Mr. Fott can explain what that might mean. Mr. Fott explained. Carefully, technically, at length. What he was describing, stripped of its professional language, was this. If leases had been signed in Tuan's name as representative, and if I had not formalized his authority, and if a tenant dispute arose, I might find myself in a position where my ownership was questioned rather than his authority. The building was already operating under new terms. The building was already, in the documents that existed in the world, partially his, and I was being asked to sign the papers that would make the rest of it follow. They left without my signature, but Tuan paused at the door with his hand on the frame and looked back at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not anger. Not quite. Something colder than anger. Sister, he said, I hope you'll think carefully. The people who wait too long to make decisions often find the decisions get made for them. The door closed. I stood in my hallway and listened to the cars leave and looked at the 2 documents still on my kitchen table and thought about what he had said about Dung, about my son who was far away and had been spoken to and had apparently agreed, and I felt something move in my chest that I had not allowed myself to feel until now. Not fear, not anger. The specific loneliness of a person who has just discovered they are more alone than they believed. The pen was still on the table where Mr. Fat had left it. I picked it up and put it in the drawer. Not because I was going to sign, but because I was not going to leave it sitting there where they had placed it, in the middle of my kitchen table, as though the signing were already decided and only the moment remained. My house, my table. But outside, in the rooms below, in the files of an arbitration body whose name I had never heard, in the documents Tuan had been building for 3 years while I received envelopes on the first of the month out there, the story was already being written in someone else's handwriting, and I had perhaps run out of time to write my own version. Or perhaps not. I went to the phone and called the one number I had been saving for the right moment. The number Mr. Hong had given me quietly on my way out the door 2 weeks ago. The number of a woman at the land registry office who owed him a professional courtesy and who, he had said, knew how to look at a filing history without asking too many questions. I told her what I needed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would call me back in 2 hours. I sat down at the kitchen table across from the 2 unsigned documents and I waited, and I did not look at the pen, and I did not look at the door, and I looked instead at the altar and at Hung's photograph and at the incense I had not yet lit this morning. 2 hours. I could wait 2 hours. I had been waiting, one way or another, for 3 years. The woman from the land registry called back in 1 hour and 40 minutes. Her name was Mrs. Tuyet. She had a voice that was professionally neutral in the way of people who spend their days handling other people's most important documents and have learned to treat significance with the same tone they use for the ordinary. She said she had reviewed the filing history for the property. She asked if I was somewhere I could speak privately. I said yes. She said she would read me what she had found, and that I should write it down. I had the navy notebook open on the table. I held the pen, my pen, the one from the drawer, and I wrote what she read to me, and I wrote it carefully, and I did not interrupt her. It took 11 minutes. When she finished, I thanked her. She said she was sorry, in the tone of someone who means it but has learned to mean it briefly. She said if I needed official copies I could make a formal request in writing. I said I understood. I said I would be in touch. I put the phone down on the table. I did not move for a long time. Outside, a child was playing on the street below. I could hear the irregular rhythm of a ball against pavement, the way it accelerates between bounces when it finds its own momentum. My husband had painted this room in the first year we lived here, a pale yellow he had chosen himself, which I had questioned because I thought it was too light, and he had said light was the point. He wanted the room to feel like morning. He had been right. For 30 years, this room had felt like morning, the light coming through the east window, and catching the edge of everything with a particular gold that I had stopped consciously noticing the way you stop noticing any constant thing. I noticed it now. I looked at the yellow wall, and the morning light, and the altar, and Hung's photograph, and I thought, if you were still here, this would not have happened. And then I thought, it might have, because it began before you died, and you did not see it either. That was the thing Mrs. Tuyet had told me that I needed to sit with before I could do anything else. It had not begun after Hung died. 14 months before my husband's death, a document had been filed with the land registry. A supplemental authorization form, the kind used when a property owner wishes to designate a secondary contact for administrative correspondence. Routine paperwork, on its surface, filed correctly, stamped correctly, processed without incident, because it was a common filing and no one had reason to look at it twice. The secondary contact designated was Win Thon Tuan. The owner's signature on that form matched my husband's signature closely enough to have passed review. Closely enough? Hung had not filed that form. I knew this with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with 30 years of knowing one person's handwriting so well that the slightly wrong character for agreement was as familiar to me as my own. Reflection. My husband had not known his brother was doing this. He had been sick by then, not gravely, not yet, but the kind of sick that makes a man focus on what is in front of him and trust the people around him to handle what is not. Someone had used that trust. Someone had been practicing signatures. I had found the notation on the lease for Unit 1 18 months ago, or rather, 18 months before I found it, which meant the practice had been happening longer, and the filing had been the proof that the practice had reached the level of confidence required to submit something official. And then Hung had died, and the building had needed managing. Antoine had appeared at my kitchen table with his easy manner and his recommendation of a reliable man he knew, and I had been a widow of 2 months who was trying not to make things difficult. He had not found his opportunity after Hung died. He had been creating it before. The rest of what Mrs. Tuyet had read to me was worse. 6 months ago, 4 months before the Tuesday morning with Mr. Fat and the leather briefcase and the documents I had not signed a second filing had been submitted to the land registry. A change of designated management representative, expanding Tuan's administrative authority to include correspondence related to lease modifications and tenant agreements. My signature was on that form, or the signature that had been filed as mine. I looked at my own handwriting in the Navy notebook, the neat vertical characters I had written while Mrs. Tuyet spoke, and I thought about what Mr. Hong had said. Approximate. About someone who had been practicing and had gotten very good. 6 months ago, I had not signed any document related to the land registry. I had not been to any government office. I had not authorized any change to anything. But in the official record, I had. And then, 3 months ago, 1 month before the anniversary dinner, when Tuan had stood in my house in front of my husband's altar and called me forgetful in front of my son, the most recent filing. A preliminary application for change of property classification. Ground floor units. Units 1, 3, and 5. Application to reclassify from residential to mixed commercial residential use. Applicant, Nguyen Than Tuan, authorized representative. Owner's acknowledgement signature, attached. I set the pen down. I picked it back up because my hands needed something to hold. Not my signature. I had not written that signature. But in the official record, I had acknowledged the application. I had agreed that the ground floor of the building my husband built, the floor he had argued with contractors over, the floor whose tiles he had laid himself on weekends over 3 months, the floor where Mrs. Na had stood in the rain with her inside-out umbrella and laughed, and said she always wanted to be somewhere from the beginning. That floor was in the process of being reclassified. The first step before sale. The first step before demolition. The first step before everything my husband built became something else entirely. And in the files of the land registry, I had agreed to it. I do not know how long I sat at the table. Long enough for the light to move across the wall, for the child and the ball to disappear from the street below, for the tea in my cup to go cold. Long enough for the first shock to pass and leave behind something denser and more lasting. Not grief exactly, because grief is for things that have been lost, and I had not lost anything yet, but the particular weight of understanding the full shape of what someone has done to you, not just what they took, but how long they planned, how carefully, how completely. He had been inside my house. Not just the kitchen, not just the table where he sat and drank tea and asked about my health. He had been to the drawer. He had handled the documents. He had studied Hung's handwriting and then mine, had practiced until he could replicate both, and had spent years executing a plan that began when my husband was still alive, that took advantage of a dying man's trust, that used a widow's grief as its operating condition. I thought of Tuan at the anniversary dinner, standing near the door in his checked shirt, his hair combed too carefully, his voice warm with pretend concern, saying the words he had calculated would do the most damage in front of the most people. She's too old to understand what she signed. She's too old. He had been counting on that. He had been designing that story for years, building the evidence that I was confused, that my memory failed, that my signature appeared on documents I didn't remember signing because I was a woman of a certain age and certain decline. By the time anyone looked, the record would show an old woman who had gradually, willingly, handed over the management of what she could no longer handle. A record built on forgeries, filed without my knowledge, in my name. I looked at Hung's photograph on the altar. The one from the university graduation, when he was still strong, when he stood straight and proud without his back complaining. I thought about what he would say, Not about Tuan, not in anger, but to me. What he would say to me right now? He would say, "You already have the evidence. Stop sitting in the dark and use it." He would say it in that patient, particular way of his, the way that was never unkind but also never willing to let me stand still when there was something to be done. I opened the Navy notebook to a fresh page. I wrote, "Official copies, land registry, all filings request in writing." I wrote, "Mrs. Na, original lease, original receipts." I wrote, "All 7 remaining leases, photographs, copies." I wrote, "Mr. Hoang, formal statement, notary verification of signature discrepancies." I wrote, "Dung." I looked at that last word for a long moment. Dung. My son, who was far away, who Tuan had called and spoken to, who had been told that his mother needed support, and had perhaps agreed because he was a good son in the way that good sons who are far away are good sons, trusting, affectionate, not sufficiently attentive. Tuan had reached him first, that was the damage of it. My son already had a version of this story in his head, and it was Tuan's version, which meant it was a version in which I was the problem to be managed rather than the person who had been wronged. I would need to reach him with evidence in hand. Not explanations, not emotions, not a mother's account of what she believed to be true. Evidence, the kind that exists on paper, in filing dates, in signature comparisons, in the gap between what was submitted to the land registry and what I had actually signed. The kind that speaks for itself. The kind I had been building, in a Navy notebook, in 2 hours of careful phone calls, in 30 years of never throwing anything away. I closed the notebook and placed my hand flat on the cover and sat in the yellow morning light of a room my husband had painted because he wanted it to feel like morning. Then I stood up. I had a list. I had evidence. I had been a woman who spent 27 years making sure the right things were recorded in the right places, and the people who had decided I was too old to understand what I had signed were about to discover what it meant to be on the wrong side of someone who understood documents better than they did. But first I needed to call my son before Tuan called him again. And I needed to call him with something in my hand that he could not dismiss, could not explain away, could not attribute to a mother's confusion or an old woman's mistaken memory. I picked up the phone. I dialed. It rang 3 times, and on the 4th ring, my son answered, and I said, "Dung, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you not to say anything until I have finished." And for once, for the first time in perhaps 2 years, he was quiet, and I began. Dung listened. That was the thing I had not allowed myself to expect, and the thing that mattered most in the days that followed. He listened for 22 minutes while I spoke, and he did not interrupt, and when I finished there was a silence on the line that felt different from all the other silences between us over the years, not the silence of a son managing a mother's concern, not the silence of someone waiting politely for the end of a story that does not require his action, a different silence, the silence of a person recalibrating everything he thought he understood. Then he said, "I'm coming home." I told him not yet. I told him I needed 2 more weeks, and I needed him to not call Tuan, not answer Tuan's calls, not give any indication that anything had changed between our conversation on the phone last week and this one. I needed Tuan to believe that nothing had shifted. That the old woman in the house above the building was still sitting in the same chair, still uncertain, still on the verge of being persuaded. Dung was quiet again. Then, "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He said, "Tell me what you need me to do." I told him. The 2 weeks that followed were the most deliberate of my life. I say this as a woman who spent 27 years being deliberate for a living, who had learned the difference between efficiency and thoroughness, who understood that the documents you file correctly the first time never come back to haunt you, and the ones you rush always do. I had been deliberate in that professional sense for most of my adult life. But this was different. This was the deliberateness of a person who knows she has one chance to assemble something that must hold up against lawyers and money and a man who had been planning for years. I made a schedule. I did not write it in the Navy notebook that was evidence now, not a planning document. I made the schedule in my head, and I held it there each morning when I woke at 5 and reviewed what had been accomplished and what remained. The first task was the land registry copies. I submitted my written request the morning after I spoke to Dung, in person, at the district office, dressed in the way I used to dress for important meetings at the commune, neatly, quietly, in a way that communicated capability without announcing it. The clerk who took my request was young and looked at the form with the mild attention of someone who processes many similar forms each day. I had written the request in official language, the kind of language you learn after years of drafting correspondence for committee chairmen, the kind that communicates that the person submitting it knows exactly what she is asking for and exactly what the office is obligated to provide. The copies arrived in 4 days. I sat at the kitchen table and went through them page by page, comparing each filing against the timeline I had constructed in my head. The supplemental authorization from 14 months before Hung's death, the management representative expansion from 6 months ago, the preliminary reclassification application from 3 months ago, each one with a signature that was not mine, or not my husband's, but close enough to have passed administrative review by someone who was not looking for forgery. I photographed each page with my phone, a skill Dung had taught me 2 years ago that I had not expected to need for this purpose. Then I placed the originals in a folder, and the folder in a bag that I carried with me whenever I left the house. I did not leave the documents in the drawer. Not anymore. The second task was the signature comparison. Mr. Hoang had given me a name, along with the land registry contact, a retired forensic document examiner named Mr. Hoang Bin, who had spent 20 years working with the city's courts before his retirement, and who occasionally provided informal assessments for people who needed a professional opinion without the formality of a court order. I called him. I described what I had. He asked me to come on a Thursday afternoon. His home office was a back room that smelled like ink and precision, shelves of reference materials, a large format magnifying glass on a stand, a light table of the kind used for examining documents at the level of paper fiber and ink absorption. He was a small man with the unhurried manner of someone who has spent a lifetime looking at things very closely and has learned that what appears obvious at a glance is rarely the whole story. He examined the forged signatures for 40 minutes. He compared them against authentic samples I had brought, receipts in my handwriting, documents in Hung's, pulled from the years of files I had kept in the drawer beneath the altar. He said nothing while he worked. I sat in the chair across from his table and watched the light move on the ceiling and waited. When he finished, he straightened and removed the magnifying eyepiece he had clipped to his glasses. The signatures attributed to your husband, he said, were produced by someone with extended practice access to authentic samples. The pen pressure pattern is consistent, but the execution speed is wrong too, controlled. Your husband signed quickly. This person was being careful. And mine? Yours are more recent and more confident. Whoever did this spent less time on yours, which suggests they found it easier, or that by the time they got to yours, they had more experience. He looked at me directly. This is not a casual forgery. This is someone who had time and access and motivation. Would you put that in writing? He looked at me for a moment. I'll prepare a formal assessment document. It won't carry the weight of court-commissioned analysis, but it will establish a professional basis for the discrepancy claims, sufficient to support a legal filing. I thanked him. He named a fee that I paid without negotiating, because there are moments when the cost of something is not the relevant consideration. The third task was the receipts. Mrs. Na had provided hers. Mrs. Fuang in Unit 5, when I visited her with a box of fruit and a carefully worded explanation of why I was asking, produced a complete set going back 2 years, bundled neatly with rubber bands by month. The Lam family on the 4th floor had theirs in a folder on a shelf. The kind of orderly record-keeping I recognized because it resembled my own. 3 sets of original receipts, all showing amounts paid to H2, all significantly higher than the monthly figure I had been receiving. I photographed each one. I recorded the discrepancies in a summary table I constructed on paper. 1 column for the receipt amount, 1 for the ledger entry, 1 for the difference, 1 for the cumulative total by month. The cumulative total, across the 3 tenants whose records I had confirmed, was 141 million dong. For 3 tenants out of 8. For the months, those 3 had documented records. I was not going to pursue the full amount in this room. With this evidence, this time, I was going to use what I had to establish the pattern. The pattern was enough. It was more than enough. Dung arrived on a Friday, quietly, in the afternoon, while the street was busy with the end-of-day noise that covers small arrivals. He had not called Tuan. He had told no one in the extended family that he was coming. He sat at my kitchen table and I showed him the Navy notebook, and the official copies, and the document examiner's written assessment and the summary table of rent discrepancies, and I watched my son's face move through the same sequence of expressions that I had moved through over the previous weeks, ending in the same place. That cold, dense weight that is not quite anger because anger is too simple. He said, "What do we do now?" I told him about the meeting at the UBND. I had made the appointment 3 days earlier, through a contact I still had from the commune office, a woman I had trained when she was new, 20 years ago, who was now a mid-level administrator with access to the scheduling of official proceedings. I had explained what I needed. She had been quiet, and then she had said she could arrange it, and that she would ensure the right people were present. The meeting was in 4 days. I had sent Tuan a message 2 days earlier, framed as a response to his Tuesday morning visit. Framed as a capitulation. I told him I had thought about the documents. I told him I would like to discuss them further, that I had some questions about the process, that perhaps we could meet somewhere official to make sure everything was handled correctly. I suggested the UBND office. He had responded within an hour. Warm, accommodating, delighted. He said he would bring Mr. Fott. He said the UBND was an excellent idea, very proper. He appreciated that I was being sensible. He said he would see me Thursday. I put the phone down and looked at Dung across the kitchen table. My son, who had come home without announcing himself, who was sitting in the house where he had grown up, who was looking at me with an expression I recognized from when he was very young, the expression of a child who has just understood that his mother is capable of something he did not know she was capable of. He thinks he's coming to finish it, Dung said. He is coming to finish it, I said. He's just wrong about how it ends. I closed the Navy notebook and placed it on top of the folder of documents, and squared the edges the way I used to square documents before a meeting, the habit of 27 years in a room where presentation was part of the argument. 4 days. 4 days, and the UBND office, and the room where I had spent the best years of my working life, and the people who would be present, and the documents I had assembled with the same care I had given to every important record in my life. 4 days, and Tuan would walk through a door expecting to find an old woman ready to sign, and he would find instead everything that had been building since the first discrepancy I had written in the margin of a green ledger, the first quiet question in handwriting smaller than usual, the first careful note in a navy blue notebook that no one else had ever touched. The storm had been forming for a long time. On Thursday, it would arrive. I arrived 30 minutes early. This was intentional. In 27 years of commune work, I had learned that the person who arrives first to a difficult meeting controls more than their seat. They control the temperature of the room, the arrangement of chairs, the direction everyone faces when they walk in. Small advantages, perhaps, but I had built my entire counter-offensive on small advantages accumulated carefully, and I was not going to stop now. The room they had given us was on the 2nd floor, medium-sized, official without being imposing, a rectangular table with 8 chairs, a window overlooking the courtyard where I had walked so many mornings with paperwork under my arm. The administrative officer, my former colleague Lan, who had arranged this without asking unnecessary questions, showed me in and offered tea. I accepted. She brought 2 cups and set them at my end of the table. I placed my folder in the center of my position, not open, just present. Then I sat down and looked at the room and thought about how many documents I had processed in a building like this one over the course of my working life, how many disputes I had watched be resolved or not resolved, how many people had sat across tables and believed that the authority in the room was against them. Today, the authority in the room had spent 27 years learning how it worked. Tuan arrived 7 minutes before the scheduled time, which told me he was eager. Eager people make small errors. He came in with Mr. Fat and H2, the same formation as the Tuesday visit, the same checked shirt, the same leather briefcase. He looked at me and at the folder on the table, and at the 2 teacups, and his smile did what it always did, arrived first and stayed slightly too long. Sister. He pulled out the chair across from me, and sat with the ease of a man settling into a room he already owns. I'm glad you decided to do this properly. It's the right choice. Mr. Fott set his briefcase on the table and opened it. H2 took the chair to Tuan's left, and looked at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who did not expect to be surprised. Then the door opened again. Dung came in first. Then Mrs. Na, her white hair neat, her posture straight. Then Mrs. Fuang from Unit 5, who had put on a formal blouse for the occasion. Then Mr. Hoang, the retired notary, moving slowly, but with the deliberateness of someone who understood exactly why he was here. And then, behind all of them, Lan, the administrative officer, followed by a woman I introduced to no one immediately. A woman who worked at the Land Registry District Office, who had processed my formal documentation request, and who had agreed, after some correspondence and some professional persuasion from Mr. Hoang, to be present today in her official capacity. Tuan's smile changed. Not disappeared. Changed. Became something more careful, more assessing. He looked at the people filing in around the table and then he looked at me, and I watched him perform a rapid internal calculation, the kind that ends in one of two decisions: advance or retreat. He chose advance. Of course he did. He had invested too much to retreat. I didn't realize this was going to be a family gathering, he said, with the lightness of a man who has decided to be amused. It's not a family gathering, I said. It's a documentation review. Please sit down. Mr. Fott leaned toward Tuan and said something quiet. Tuan nodded. I opened my folder. I had organized it the way I used to organize presentations for committee chairmen, chronologically, with a summary page at the front that listed each document, its date, and its relevance, so that anyone in the room could follow the sequence without getting lost. 27 years of habit. I had typed the summary on a sheet of paper the previous evening and printed 3 copies, which I now distributed to Lan, the land registry officer, and Mr. Hoang. I'd like to begin with the land registry filings, I said. Mr. Fat started to speak. I continued. The first filing is dated 14 months before my husband's death. A supplemental authorization form designating Win Than Tuan as secondary administrative contact for the property. I placed the official copy on the table and turned it to face the land registry officer. My husband did not file this document. The signature attributed to him was produced by someone with extended practice access to his authentic handwriting. I have a formal assessment from a document examiner which I will enter into this record. I placed Mr. Bin's assessment beside the filing. Tuan's expression had settled into something neutral and watchful. He was good at neutral. He had been practicing it as long as he had been practicing signatures. The second filing, I said, is dated 6 months ago. A change of management representative authority, including authorization to correspond with government offices regarding lease modifications. I placed the copy. This document carries my signature. I did not sign it. The same forensic assessment covers this discrepancy. Sister, I'm not finished. I said it the way I had said things to junior clerks who spoke out of turn. Quiet. Absolute. He stopped. The third filing is dated 3 months ago, a preliminary application for commercial residential reclassification of the ground floor units, submitted by Tuan as authorized representative, with my signature attached as owner's acknowledgement. I placed the third copy. I did not sign this document either. I looked at the land registry officer. She was reading. Her face was professionally composed, but her eyes were moving quickly across the page. The eyes of someone recognizing something she should have seen when it first crossed her desk. The rent discrepancy, I continued, and I took out the summary table, the 1 column for receipt amounts, 1 for ledger entries, 1 for differences, 1 for cumulative totals, and I placed it in the center of the table where everyone could see. For 3 years, I received 6 million dong per month as consolidated rental income from this building. The actual rental income, as documented by tenant receipts in this room, averaged 11,400,000 dong per month. The difference, for the tenants whose records I have been able to verify, totals 141 million dong. Mrs. Nga placed her envelope of receipts on the table. Mrs. Fuang placed hers. Mr. Hoang, who had agreed to serve as formal witness to the documentation process, noted their submission in the record he was keeping. H2 was looking at the receipts with the expression of a man watching a controlled demolition and knowing that the building coming down is the one he is standing in. Tuan said, "These numbers are out of context. There were management fees, maintenance costs, The maintenance costs, I said, are documented here. I removed the section of the folder covering phantom repairs. 2 confirmed instances of repair costs claimed and collected against my ledger. For work that building tenants confirm was never performed. I can provide the tenant statements. I did not look at Tuan as I said this. I looked at the documents. I had learned years ago that the most devastating thing you can do to someone who expects emotional confrontation is to treat their actions as an administrative matter, not personal, not heated. Simply a set of facts requiring documentation and resolution. Mr. Fat had stopped taking notes. He was reading the forensic assessment, and his face had acquired the particular stillness of a lawyer who is calculating liability. The unauthorized lease document, I said. I placed Mrs. Na's copy of the Form H2 had brought her the one naming Tuan as representative of the property, the one she had refused to sign. This document was presented to at least one tenant without my knowledge, in my name, naming a person who does not have legal authority to represent this property. Combined with the forged authorization filings, this constitutes a pattern of systematic misrepresentation of ownership. I looked up then at Tuan. He was sitting very still in his checked shirt, his hair combed too carefully, his hands flat on the table. He was looking at the documents spread between us, and doing what all such men do when the evidence arrives, calculating which version of events could still be salvaged, which story could still be told, which piece could be extracted from the wreckage. And I thought of the anniversary dinner, the incense burning on the altar. His voice, warm and careful, landing on the word forgetful like a hand on a wound. She's getting older. She signs papers, and doesn't know what she signed. I did not say this aloud. I did not need to. The room full of people, the land registry officer reading the forged filings, Mrs. Na sitting straight-backed with her 30-year lease on the table in front of her. Mr. Hoang recording everything. This was the answer. Not a speech. Not a confrontation. This. A woman who remembered everything. Who had written down everything. Who had kept every receipt and noted every discrepancy and built, in 2 weeks of early mornings and careful phone calls, a record that spoke for itself. That was the answer to what he had said about me in front of my husband's altar. Not words, paper. I understood documents, it turned out, a great deal better than he did. Dung had not spoken. He sat beside me, and I had felt him watching me throughout, and now I felt him sit back slightly, the small movement of someone releasing a breath they have been holding. Lan said, formally, for the record, Mrs. Lati Min Chow, can you confirm that all documents submitted today are authentic originals or official copies? I confirm, I said. And that you are prepared to pursue formal legal remedy for the filings made without your authorization? I am. She made a note. Tuan's lawyer began to speak, carefully, professionally, about procedural matters and the need for further review and the complexity of long-term family property arrangements. It was the sound of a man buying time because time was all that remained to be bought. I placed my hands flat on the table and waited for him to finish. I had learned how to wait. I had learned it long before any of this began, in the 30 years of tending something quietly and carefully, in the 27 years of making sure the right things were recorded in the right places, in all the early mornings and patient evenings of a life that people like Tuan looked at and saw only a woman who was getting older. I let him speak. Then I said, I would like to formally request the nullification of all 3 unauthorized filings. And the land registry officer opened her own folder and said, I have the relevant forms here. And the room that had been mine for 27 years, the room that remembered me when I was young and capable, and no one thought to call me forgetful, did what it had always done. It received the documents. It made them official. It recorded what was true. What happened to Tuan and H2 in the weeks that followed did not require my involvement. That was the thing I had not fully anticipated. And the thing that I found, in retrospect, to be the most precise form of justice available to a woman who had spent her career understanding how official processes worked. I had submitted the documents. I had made the formal requests. I had placed the evidence in the correct hands in the correct room with the correct witnesses present. After that, the system I had served for 27 years simply did what systems do when someone finally gives them accurate information. It ran. The Land Registry Office initiated an internal review within 48 hours of our meeting. This was faster than I had expected, and I attributed it partly to the presence of the land registry officer at the table, who had seen the forged filings with her own eyes, and understood that her office had processed documents that should not have been processed. Institutional embarrassment is a powerful accelerant. When an office discovers it has been used as a tool in someone else's fraud, it moves quickly, not out of justice exactly, but out of the specific urgency of an institution that wants to correct the record before the record becomes the story. The nullification of all 3 unauthorized filings was confirmed in writing within 10 days. The preliminary reclassification application for the ground floor units was withdrawn from review, flagged, and added to the investigation file. The management representative designation was voided. The supplemental authorization from 14 months before Hung's death, the one with my husband's practice signature, the one that had started all of it, was formally noted as potentially fraudulent and referred to the appropriate investigative body. Referred. That word did a great deal of work in the weeks that followed. H2 broke first. I learned this from Lan, who heard it through the administrative channels that flow through a district office like water through pipes, invisibly, constantly, available to those who know where the taps are. H2 had been summoned for questioning by the investigative body handling the fraud referral. He had arrived with no lawyer. This was his first mistake. His second was believing that loyalty to Tuan would be reciprocated. Tuan, when contacted, had sent Mr. Fat, a lawyer, expensive and prepared, which is the response of a man who has resources and intends to use them to protect the most important thing, which in Tuan's case was Tuan. H2, who had no such resources and had not thought to accumulate them, found himself in a room with investigators asking questions about rent collection practices, about receipts issued to tenants, about the cash amounts he had delivered to a property owner compared to the amounts he had collected from her tenants. He was not a sophisticated man. He had been, I thought, a man who had been offered a simple arrangement: collect the rent, keep a portion, deliver the rest, say nothing, and had not thought far enough ahead to consider what happened when the arrangement unraveled. He had not planned this. He had participated in it. Those are different things, and they carry different weights, but they carry weight nonetheless. He provided a full account of the rent collection practices over 3 years. Every month, every unit, every amount collected, and every amount delivered. The investigators compared his account against my green ledger, against the tenant receipts, against the summary table I had prepared. The numbers aligned with what I had documented. The discrepancy over 3 years, across all 8 units, was 218 million dong. I had estimated 197 million from the partial records I had access to. The actual figure was higher, 21 million higher. Units whose tenants had not kept receipts. Tenants who had paid slightly more than their lease amounts in recent months without understanding why. Adjustments H2 had made that I would not have caught without his own account to complete the picture. 218 million dong. Taken from a widow across 36 months, in envelopes on the first of the month, by a man in dark trousers, with clean shoes, who smiled and called it management. Tuan's situation was more complicated, because Tuan was more complicated, and because Mr. Fott was genuinely skilled at the particular art of making complicated things appear simple. What Mr. Fott could not do was explain the signatures. Mr. Bin's forensic assessment had established the discrepancies clearly enough to support the fraud referral, but it was not the forensic assessment that undid Tuan in the end. It was the documents themselves. 14 months before Hung's death, the date on the supplemental authorization, the date of that first forged filing, placed the beginning of this plan at a time when my husband was still alive, still managing his affairs, still capable of making his own decisions. Investigators asked Tuan to explain why he would have been designated as secondary administrative contact by a man who was still active and capable. Tuan said Hung had asked him to. That they had discussed it. That it was an informal family arrangement made official. They asked if he had any record of that conversation, any correspondence, any witness, any documentation of Hung's expressed intention. He did not. They asked him to account for the gap between the date of the filing and the date of his actual involvement in property management, which had begun 2 months after Hung's death. He said the filing had been in preparation for an eventual transition. They asked whose idea the transition had been. He said it was a mutual discussion. They asked him to name one person who had witnessed any part of that mutual discussion. He named no one. Because there was no one. Because the discussion had never taken place. I was not present for any of this. I learned it through Lon and through Dung, who had quietly contacted the investigative officer and made himself available as a source of information about the family's history with the property. What Dung told them was straightforward. His father had never mentioned Tuan in connection with the building. His father had never suggested a transition of administrative authority. The building had been solely his parents' project, managed between the two of them, and when his father died, his mother had handled it alone. He said it without drama, without anger. As a statement of fact, the way a person raised by a woman who valued accurate records states facts precisely, with the documents to support it. That, in the end, was what finished Tuan. Not outrage, not confrontation. A son, sitting in an official room, stating what was true in the same tone his mother would have used. Mr. Fott withdrew from the case 3 weeks after our meeting at the UBND office. He cited a conflict of interest, which is the professional way a lawyer says, "I will not be found standing next to this when it resolves." He was replaced by a different lawyer, younger, less expensive, visibly less confident about the material he had been handed. It was the replacement that told me more than anything else how the situation had shifted. You do not downgrade your legal representation when things are going well. Tuan called me once during this period. I almost did not answer. Then I did, because I was curious, and because I had learned that curiosity is more useful than avoidance when you are trying to understand the full shape of a thing. He said, "Sister, I think we've both let this go further than it needed to." I said nothing. He said, "These investigations, this official involvement, it's damaging to the whole family, to Dung's reputation, to the property's value. I think if we sat down together, without lawyers, without—" I said, "Tuan." He stopped. I said, "You stood in my house, in front of my husband's altar, on the anniversary of his death, in front of my son, and you told everyone in the room that I was too old to understand what I had signed." Silence on the line. I said, "I understood every word of every document you put in front of me. I understood every discrepancy in every envelope you brought me for 3 years. I understood the authorization filings before the land registry officer did. I understood the signature forgeries before the forensic examiner confirmed them. I have understood everything, the entire time, more completely than you did, because I kept a ledger and you assumed I wouldn't." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "Do not call me sister again." I ended the call. I put the phone down on the kitchen table, the same table where he had sat and drunk tea, and looked around the room with the eyes of a man measuring what he intended to acquire. The light was coming through the east window at the angle that made everything look like morning. The pale gold that fell across the wall my husband had painted because he wanted the room to feel like morning. I sat in that light for a while, and did not think about Tuan or H2 or Mr. Fat or any of it. I thought about the first morning after the anniversary dinner, when I had made 2 cups of tea and sat alone, and realized I needed to open the drawer and count carefully. How that morning had felt like the beginning of something I was not sure I could manage. Dung came downstairs. He was staying in his old room, had been for 3 weeks now, would stay until the formal proceedings were resolved, and poured himself tea and sat down across from me. "Mr. Fott withdrew," he said. "I know. The investigative office called this morning. They want to schedule a formal session next week to review the complete financial documentation." He looked at me. "They think the rent recovery claim is strong." "It is strong," I said. "I documented it for 3 years." He smiled, and in the smile I saw something I had not seen in a long time, the expression of a son who is not managing a mother, not worrying about a mother, not receiving the polite reassurances of a mother who does not want to be a burden. Just a son, looking at his mother with the particular admiration of someone who has watched her do something difficult and understood for the first time what she was capable of. Outside, the morning sounds of the street came through the window. The market beginning its day, motorbikes and voices, and the smell of broth from somewhere nearby. The ordinary world, continuing. The ledger, I thought, did not close when the entries stopped. It closed when the accounting was complete, when the numbers on both sides finally matched, when everything that had been taken was acknowledged, recorded, and returned to the column where it belonged. We were almost there. 1 chapter left to account for, and that one had nothing to do with Tuan. The formal recovery proceedings concluded on a Thursday in late autumn. I know it was late autumn because the frangipani tree in the courtyard of the UBND office had dropped most of its leaves, and the remaining ones had turned the color of old paper, and I had stood beneath it for a moment before going inside, looking up through the bare branches at a sky that was the particular pale blue of the season's end. It was the kind of morning that smells like cooling earth and distant smoke, the smell of things completing themselves, of cycles arriving at their natural terminus before the turning begins again. I had worn my good dye, dark blue, nearly navy, the one I had bought for Dung's university graduation and worn 3 times since then for occasions that required a certain formality. My hair was up, pinned neatly, the white of it no longer something I thought about in terms of age, but simply as what my hair was, the color it had become over the years of work and ordinary living, the color it would remain. Dung met me at the entrance. He was wearing a proper shirt, collar buttoned, and he had combed his hair the way he used to comb it as a child when he knew something important was happening. I did not comment on this. I simply walked in beside him. The recovery amount was officially confirmed at 194 million dong. Not the full 218. The investigators had been careful and thorough, and the figure they certified was the amount they could establish beyond procedural doubt from the documentation on record, my ledger, the tenant receipts, H2's own account, the cross-reference summary table I had prepared. Some months remained ambiguous in the records of tenants who had not kept receipts, and I had not pressed for what could not be cleanly proven. The principle had been established. The documentation had held. 194 million dong, to be recovered through the legal process, in installments, over time. I did not think of it as a windfall. I thought of it as the building returning what the building had always produced. The correct amount, properly accounted for, entering the correct column of the ledger at last. H2 had cooperated fully with the proceedings and had been assigned a repayment arrangement commensurate with his means. He was not a wealthy man. He had been a man offered an easy arrangement by someone who understood exactly how to make dishonesty feel manageable, who had not looked far enough ahead to see what the end of it looked like. I did not forgive him for what he had done, but I also did not think about him very much. He was a small instrument in a larger design, and the design was what mattered. Tuan was a different matter, and his proceedings were separate and ongoing. The fraud investigation, the forged signatures, the unauthorized filings, these were not civil matters that could be resolved with repayment schedules. They were referred to the appropriate body for criminal consideration, and that process would unfold at whatever pace such processes unfold, without my active involvement, and without my particular concern. I had submitted the documents. I had stated what was true. What happened next was not mine to manage. The unauthorized filings had been nullified. The reclassification application had been formally withdrawn from all records. The ground floor units, the 3 units Tuan had intended to convert, to reclassify, to prepare for sale to someone who would have turned them into something my husband would not have recognized, remained residential. Mrs. Na remained in Unit 3. That was the thing that mattered most to me, in the end. Not the money recovered, not the official confirmation of what I had always known, not even the formal recognition that the signatures were forged and the filings were fraudulent. Those things were necessary, and I had pursued them with everything I had. But what I felt when I walked out of that building for the last time in an official capacity and knew that Mrs. Na was still in Unit 3, that the seamstress with the inside-out umbrella, who had stood in the rain on a Thursday in March 30 years ago, was still in the place she had chosen when it was still being built, that was the feeling I had worked toward without knowing how to name it. Continuity. The particular dignity of things remaining what they were meant to be. In the weeks after the proceedings closed, I found a rhythm. Not the rhythm of the first 3 years, the rhythm of envelopes on the first of the month, and questions I set aside and trust extended past the point where trust was warranted. A different rhythm, the rhythm of a woman who manages her own building again, directly, with full knowledge of what she is managing. I reviewed all 8 leases. The ones in my folder, and the ones I had obtained copies of from tenants. The ones that had been presented under Tuan's name, and that were now voided and replaced with correct documentation. I sat with each tenant individually, not H2 as intermediary, not Tuan as representative, but myself, at this table or at theirs, with the original lease and the current terms, and a conversation conducted between adults who understand what they have agreed to. Mrs. Fwang in Unit 5 needed a repair to her bathroom tiles. The grout, cracked for 4 years, reported twice, and ignored. I arranged it within a week. I paid for it with the first of the recovered funds. It seemed the correct use. Mr. and Mrs. Lamb on the 4th floor needed the hallway light fixed. Done. The young couple in Unit 2, new tenants, signed under false terms, uncertain about their position when all of this became known, needed reassurance and a correct lease. I gave them both. They brought me cake when I delivered the new paperwork, a small gesture that embarrassed me slightly and pleased me considerably. Dung extended his stay by 2 weeks, then 2 more. He was working remotely, which was possible in a way it would not have been when he was young, and he seemed in no particular hurry to return south. We ate dinner together most evenings. He asked questions about the building, about the tenants, about how the management worked, questions he had never thought to ask before. I answered all of them. One evening he asked if he could look at the green ledger. I brought it from the drawer and set it on the table in front of him. He opened it to the first page. My handwriting, and before that, his father's, the cramped illegible entries from the years before I took over the accounts, the character for agreement slightly wrong, in the way that was entirely Hung's own. Dung sat with it for a long time, turning pages carefully, reading. You kept this for how long? He asked. Since the building was built, I said. Your father started it, I continued. He turned another page. I didn't know. There was no reason for you to know, I said. It wasn't your job, it was mine. He looked up. It's mine now too, if you'll show me how. I looked at my son, who had come home and stayed, who was sitting at the kitchen table where I had assembled evidence and made phone calls and written in a navy blue notebook in the early mornings when I could not sleep. Who was holding the ledger with the care of someone handling something that mattered. Start at the beginning, I said. Read all of it. When you've read all of it, ask me your questions. He turned back to the first page. That evening, I lit the incense at the altar before dinner rather than after. 3 red sticks, thin smoke rising straight in the still air. Hung's photograph, the one from the graduation, his posture straight and proud. I stood there for a while, not praying exactly, not speaking. Just present in the way I had learned to be present at the altar. Attentive to what the silence held, I thought about what had been protected. The building on the narrow street behind the market, 4 floors, 8 units, solid and plain, built by a man who had borrowed money and laid tiles himself, and believed that patience and honest work would produce something worth having. The lease is in the folder, correct now, properly documented. The green ledger with its 30 years of entries, my handwriting taking over from Hung's in the middle of the 3rd year, the record continuing without interruption. The ground floor, the tenants, Mrs. Na in Unit 3. Everything my husband had built was still standing. Everything he had intended it to be, it remained. I thought about what my grandmother had told the women of our family, the thing that had been passed down like a recipe, or a scar or a seed carried in a pocket, until the ground was ready for it. Still water runs deepest. The bamboo bends in the storm, bends until it seems it must break, while the roots go down in the dark earth where no wind reaches, down and down to where the cold water is, where the permanence is, where the thing that cannot be taken lives. You cannot uproot what you cannot see. Tuan had seen an old woman in a quiet house above a building. He had seen envelopes accepted without question, documents signed without apparent comprehension, a widow grateful for the burden lifted from her hands. He had seen the surface. He had not seen the roots. The smoke from the incense rose in a straight, unbroken line, the way it always did in still air, the way it had risen on the morning of the anniversary dinner when everything that was about to happen had not yet begun, when I had stood in this room with the family gathered and felt the first cold understanding of what was being done to me, and had smiled, and had not said a word. The ledger does not lie, I thought. And the water that makes no sound is the water that runs deepest of all. To every mother, every father, every quiet person who has been told they are too old, too slow, too simple to understand what is happening around them, you are seen. The ones who built things with their hands and kept the records and stayed patient long after patience stopped being comfortable are not weak. They are the ones who know where the roots are. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories here for those of us who believe that dignity is worth fighting for, no matter our age. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone you trusted, and what did you do?